Welcome to my tour of the Wind River Indian Reservation in central western Wyoming. Here we're looking down towards the direction of the reservation from the town of Lander, Wyoming. And what makes Lander so interesting is that we had to drive quite a few hours from Salt Lake City up towards the reservation while passing nothing basically between the small towns when you turn left once you enter Wyoming at the southern western border all the way up here. There was probably one or two small towns before we hit Lander, but this specifically is a cemetery, and I decided to get out of my car and explore the cemetery because, graveyards out west often have very interesting memorials. For example, there's this one to a pre-World War I war which America got involved in when the USS Maine exploded in the Havana harbor in 1898. So interesting because this plaque is actually cast from the metal from the ship, and this is a very interesting. Nowadays, people think that the ship may have been exploded on the part of U.S. authorities just to initiate a war. But anyway, we just passed the Shoshone Rose Casino, and that is important because there are two federally recognized tribes on this reservation: the Eastern Shoshone and the Northern Arapaho. The Southern Arapaho live down in Oklahoma nowadays, but here we are driving through the community of Arapaho towards the direction of the Wind River Mountains, which, after driving hours and hours through flat prairie, is just in a beautiful, amazing range of mountains. And here we see Vote Bill Watt. He is an Arapaho man, and this is the flag of the Arapaho Nation. And there's not too much to see in the way of tourist attractions in these towns, but if you know where to drive, you can actually see a couple of pretty interesting sights. Here, we're driving towards the direction of a pretty famous painted church. It is a minor tourist attraction, not too far away from one of the museums in town. It's called St. Joseph's Church, and you can actually see in the Arapaho language written over the top of it. And if you know a little bit about the history of some of the people here, you would know Chief Wachaki, for example. Although he was the head chief of the Eastern Shoshone people, he helped translate the Bible into the Arapaho language. And this was with the help of his friend, missionary John Roberts. And I'll go into detail a little bit about this in the future. But the public school systems here are very impressive because the government pumps a lot of money into them, and the tribe has a decent amount of revenue for itself. And although Sacagawea is buried in this cemetery, I really wanted to show Wachaki before I show Sacagawea. Sacagawea is buried on the other side of the reservation, and tourists come from all over the world to see her grave and the graves of her family. But here's Wachaki. And Wachaki was one of those very, very early leaders of the Native Americans. He was recognized as a wise man and pretty much the chief of all of the Eastern Shoshone people, and he distinguished himself as a friend of the white man by becoming very good friends with mountain man Jim Bridger, and eventually Bridger married his daughter, which was his third wife, and kind of made agreements with Wachaki. For example, the Fort Bridger Agreement, which basically designated the lands to the Native Americans. But because the government didn't really take kindly to this, they broke these treaties almost immediately, and the tribes were more or less consolidated after a number of years towards these reservations. But I always loved seeing the names of Native Americans. The Only Man, and here you actually have a number of cavalry people. I believe this is from the 5th Cav, but it was most likely these men were probably killed during a contact during the American Indian War. And yeah, you see 1870s, 1880s. It might also have just been disease. They were buried right alongside Wachaki, who, in this also, you can see the background. This is Fort Wachaki, which was named after him. He is a very famous character for the Shoshone people, as well as on this reservation, and is especially just in the American West. He has been declared an honorary Western character, the Great West Hall of Fame, and his funeral was over a mile and a half long. But the descriptions left on his grave, I think, are fascinating. And he is noted as being a friend of the white man because since he was first mentioned in 1840, he has always come to the aid of people who were fur trapping. And his religious journey and his journey as a warrior chief is always fascinating to me. It's said that as he grew to be older in age, people began to question his leadership skills, and he left to the hills in order to collect the scalps of his enemies and come back. A daring feat even for a young warrior, and he became friends with Jim Bridger and helped to sign the Fort Bridger Agreement. And this gave the Native Americans all of the Great Plains, but of course the federal government broke this immediately. And when a white man killed his son, he vowed to kill any white man to get his vengeance. And then John Roberts came in, who was an Episcopalian preacher, and offered his own life. And Wachaki was so, he viewed Roberts after this as a noble man and was baptized again, I believe, in 1888. And this is the cemetery that is the most common tourist attraction on this reservation, the Sacagawea Cemetery. And it's said that Sacagawea is buried here, but as I was refueling my car midway between Salt Lake City and Fort Wachaki, I discovered that most people actually don't think that she is buried here. When I told them I was going, in fact, they kind of just smiled and said, she's not buried here. And part of me really does like to believe that because she is a Native American and this land belongs to her, that she is buried somewhere off in the mountains, and that her grave is, treated with quiet respect. And it's said that people in the early 20th century came around trying to find an official marker for Sacagawea because an interest in American history was beginning to be revived. And, for example, this is her husband, Baptiste, who was a French-Canadian fur trapper. They don't know where he is buried. He's not at least buried in the cemetery, and she had several different sons who claimed lineage from her. It's also believed that she could be buried in South Dakota. Wherever she is, she's resting in peace. But I think it is fascinating that a chief of the local Arapaho tribe and one of the most famous leaders, Chief Black Kettle, or Chief Black Coal, rather, he is buried out in the hills somewhere. And I've discovered that there was some kind of a memorial for him, but it basically is very well known only to the tribe. And in going back to Wachaki and Christianity here, we see that the Lakota killed several people who were missionaries, and they were actually preaching on this reservation. It was for decades the mission of the Indian schools to basically, the quote was, kill the Indian, save the man, to turn the Indian into a pious Christian. And a lot of these boarding school, basically war crimes, are being discovered now in Canada. And there's a lot to be discovered as well in America. But you see a lot of people on this reservation took the name Wachaki because he was such a famous, well-known man. And the Sacagawea Cemetery itself is fascinating to walk around and see the sights. This building here is actually one of the older buildings in this part of Wyoming, and it was used as a school for the Shoshone Indians, and it was used as well as a missionary and a church, because a lot of times, the schools and the churches were pretty much the same thing. And you go around the cemetery, and much like I saw at Wounded Knee, you see a lot of war graves, and you think, what must it have been like for these people in World War II? And again, the names to me are fascinating. It makes me wonder how they got these names, especially George Washington took the name of our first president. He was a scout with the Shoshone. And walking around here, you see Daniel Posey, and you see several members of the Posey family. And actually, when I had messaged somebody on the possibility of doing a tour of Wyoming, he asked if I was from the local reservation. If I was Cheyenne, he thought, because apparently a lot of Cheyenne take the name Posey. But walking around, you see a lot of people who very, very sadly went way too young. And you have here Robert Lee Tillman Jr., who was just a teenager when he died. And these kind of things happen on reservations. And I believe there was a run or a memorial ride for him. And here, again, you have U.S. Army, and he was actually the Church of Native American. I mean, these people, they worship in their teepees, which we see here, They have differing religious practices. It is generally, from what I understand, it has Christian elements as well as Native American religious elements, but I'm not an expert in these kind of religious beliefs and customs. But here we're driving past the sign for Fort Wachaki, which is the headquarters of the Wind River Reservation.